Good afternoon, good morning, good day, everyone. Really delighted to have you here with us today. My name is Pedi Obani, and I am hosting the webinar as the Africaners Parent Team Lead. Really delighted to have you here with us. This webinar is for parents who are interested in understanding more around neurodiversity. And through the conversations today, we'll be exploring with our distinguished panelists who are experts in the field, but also a parent who has the lived experience of supporting a child with neurodivergent traits. We will hear from their experiences, the kinds of support that's out there, the kinds of challenges that exist, because we do know that there are challenges. We can't shy away from that. So we will understand the challenges from their perspectives, but also the resources that are available out there. And I think the main purpose of this conversation is to reassure all of us that it is challenging, but there is support. So we will be looking into the kinds of resources that are available, some of which we already have on our parents' webpage. We will share the resources with you. We also have a community where we provide ongoing support to parents, and that is our parents' web app. Again, in the course of the conversation today, we will share how to access the parents' web app and join that community with you as well. Because we don't want this to be a one off conversation, but we want this to be a conversation starter. So we're starting the conversation this evening, and there's going to be ongoing support which we would like for you to engage with, so that we embark on this journey together to provide support to the families, the parents, and of course the children and young people who need it the most. And all of this is in celebration of Neurodiversity Week, but also as part of our commitment as an organization to provide support to parents, to ensure that through the parenting journey, they are not working alone, but they are working with the kind of resources and enablement that they need to be the best parents possible and to provide the support to the children that need it the most. So thanks so much for being here. Um, as we know, the theme for this week is neurodiversity celebration. So celebrating the diversity out there, but also celebrating the resources available to support the children who need it the most. And our aim this evening is to understand even the idea of neurodiversity. What does it mean? It's a term that more and more we hear people mention and perhaps comes up in the literature, but we want to understand neurodiversity as a concept. We also want to understand the pathways to diagnosis and support, especially taking into account the unique experiences and contexts of African and ethnic minority communities. Now, with me today to have this conversation, like I said, we have our distinguished panelists. To start with, we have with us Dr. Prithvi Peripa, and he's one person who has a lot of experience in the field. And this experience is born out of his research, but also his teaching. He is part of the Autism Center for Education and Research, and he has lots of experience working in the field of autism. So he's going to be sharing with us today his experiences around supporting families, children, and young people who have various forms of learning disabilities and autism, and also working specifically with families, children, people that come from ethnic and minority backgrounds. So he has a very good understanding of issues around autism and ethnicity and culture. And he will be delving into those issues with us today. So if you have any questions around understanding neurodiversity, but from a cultural perspective, he's the person to explore that with, which is why we have him here with us today. So thanks for being here, Prithvi. We also have with us Dr. Vivian Okoye. Again, Vivian is also a certified psychologist and a researcher in the field. In the course of today's conversation, Vivian will tell us a bit more about the research she's done on neurodiversity in African communities. So, Vivian has experience in exploring with families, parents from African backgrounds, issues around neurodiversity, issues around the experiences they've had seeking support, seeking diagnosis, and she'll be sharing with us the findings of her research. In addition to understanding neurodiversity and issues of equality and diversity, Vivian also has a background and experience in mental health, but also trauma-informed care and parenting education in an African context. So again, part of the conversation today isn't only about understanding neurodiversity, but it is really understanding it through the lens of diversity, through the lens of culture, through the lens of equality and inclusion. And so Vivian, in the course of today's conversation, will be sharing with us her experiences in this field, but also she will share with us a program that we've put together as Afrikindness to promote working in community to provide support for parents on issues of neurodiversity. So thanks for being here with us today, Vivian.
Thank you for having me.
Our other panelist is Majinda, and Majinda is a parent who has been in the field, as it were. So Majinda is here with us. Majinda Kakasi is here with us to share her experience as a parent who's supporting a child that has needs in relation to neurodiversity. Majinda is a distinguished city lawyer with nearly 2 decades of experience in the financial services sector. So she does have a legal background. And in the course of our discussion with Majinda today, you'll see where her legal background meets with her experience as a parent supporting a child who is neurodiverse. And that in itself brings a different twist to it. So Majinda, we're really thankful to you for being open and willing to share your experience with us today, because we know that this will be very enlightening for our parents and for all of us who are gathered in today's conversation. Now, Majinda and Vivian will also be part of the Parents Web app, which is why we'll be encouraging all of us who are here today to continue that conversation, take it offline, join the web app, and get ongoing support. So thanks to all our panelists for being here. Now, I'm sure you've heard enough from me and you're itching to carry on and hear from the panelists. So without further ado, we will start with asking the questions to the panelists. Now, what we will invite you to do for the audience is to consider any questions you want to put forward. If you're on Zoom, feel free to type in your questions. But if you're also joining through the live stream, just type in your questions and we'll put them through to the panelists on your behalf. So please type your questions in the chat area so that we can put them through to the panelists. So the first set of questions we will be asking the panelists will be around understanding neurodiversity. So I'll ask those questions to them. I also have some questions around what are the barriers, the common barriers to diagnosis, support, and then we will ask them about the kinds of support that's available out there. So to start with, in terms of understanding neurodiversity, I'd like to ask this question, and I'll start with Prithvi. Could you just give us an insight based on the experience you have into what neurodivergence is and what the various forms of neurodivergence are based on your research and your experience in the field? What does this all mean?
Right. I think the term neurodiversity, the way I understand it, is being used to try and change or shift the way we understand some of the disabilities or conditions that we associate with. So it's trying to emphasize that it's a different way of thinking, not necessarily a deficit way of thinking. And that's kind of a main kind of a distinction. And the term came from the field of autism. It was actually an autistic adult who started using the term neurodiversity to define the fact that simply because they think differently does not mean that they are somehow disordered or deficit kind of thing. But the term now is actually being used quite broadly by a lot of people. So neurodiversity or neurodivergent individuals could include somebody on the autistic spectrum, somebody with ADHD, somebody with, some people would use dyslexia, dyscalculia, dyspraxia as part of it. Some are including Tourette's. So the definition is expanding day by day. And I think what would be helpful, again, for us is if participants who are joining, if you just put in the chat, again, what kind of neurodivergent your child will have. That would be helping all of us to try and kind of support you too.
Thank you so much for that. And perhaps, I mean, considering your experience in the field of autism, could you maybe share, some more on what that means and how that fits into the broader scheme of things?
So the way we define medically, I suppose, clinically autism is that autism is mainly impacting an individual in terms of how they are communicating and interacting with other people. And it's a different way of thinking, which might mean that the way that people who do not have autism, neurotypical world, so to speak, our understanding may or may not work from an autistic perspective. So for some individuals on the autistic spectrum, they may find it challenging to communicate in kind of normative ways that we would expect somebody to communicate, or they may have challenges in terms of understanding unwritten social rules and understanding how to interact with other people. And not knowing all of those would mean that often autism comes with high levels of anxiety, which makes it tricky then to kind of cope with unexpected changes that are happening where the child or the young person is not really prepared for it, and they're happening. Of course, life is full of changes, so that makes it really, really tricky for some of the children, young people. But as we can see, I suppose people who are joining, autism very rarely comes on its own. Autism often comes with, as we say, cousins. So you'll have autism and dyslexia, or autism and ADHD, and autism and dyspraxia. So this kind of co-occurring conditions are quite common for children on the autistic spectrum, whether or not they are always diagnosed.
Thank you so much for that, Prithvi. I mean, it's really telling that you say it isn't a problem, but it is a difference. So we need to understand neurodiversity as more of a difference. So the people who are within that spectrum are not, they're not neurotypical. And in understanding that difference, perhaps we can then start to explore the kinds of resources that those people would need to excel. So it's really about understanding the difference and supporting that difference.
Yeah.
Thank
I mean,
you.
a phrase was used long ago by somebody called Eric Schopler in the field of autism, who said, people with autism are like people coming from a different culture. And if we think of it that way, just because it's a different culture does not mean it's wrong, but it's going to be different from what we do.
Yeah. Thank you so much. That's telling. Vivian, based on your research as well, would you like to add to the conversation?
I think Prithvi has said pretty much everything. The concept of neurodivergence or neurodiversity is to give us that shift to say, these people are not deficits, but they're just different. And I think that's really important in the way that we look at things. I think that is a more empowering way, especially since we're speaking to parents, right? That's a more empowering way to actually look at what your child is going through. To say, okay, my child is different, that then puts you in that problem-solving mode, to say, okay, how do I then engage with this difference, right? Instead of saying this child is deficit, that disempowers you and makes you feel like your child cannot be or cannot become. So that's what it is. These people are different. They receive information differently. They interpret it differently, and they can choose how to give you back that information in a different way. So it might not just be how every other person does it. And it's not also coming from, like we say, it's just brain difference. Just like what Prithvi has said, just explaining it with the analogy of culture, right? Just the way we are different in our colors, in our perception. People with autism, their brains are different. It developed differently. It's different from the typical brain. So that's what I would add.
Thank you so much for that. And I see a comment. Thanks to all our parents, participants who are leaving comments in the chat area. And I see a comment from someone saying, I am beginning to think neurotypical less common. So indeed, with the ways in which we more and more hear people experiencing neurodiversity in various forms, it's perhaps there will be a time when it becomes no longer the fact that it is neurodiversity, but it is just what it is.
Yeah.
Because it's really almost a question of numbers, prevalence, how common is this? So thanks for that. Now, one of the questions, and I think this would be on the minds of many of our many people in the audience, also on my mind, is what are some of the common signs and presentations of neurodivergence? How does this present? And this could be based on your experiences with autism, Prithvi, for instance, or Vivian, anything else. What are the common signs that we can look out for parents to think, okay, maybe I need to get some diagnosis, maybe there's something I need to follow through on? What are the things to look out for? Prithvi?
Oh, I was going to say, Vivian, did you want to go first? But yeah, okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. I mean, there is a slight disconnect or clash, and I need to say that for all the parents who are joining, because people who would use the term neurodiversity and neurodivergent would not necessarily say we need to diagnose somebody with autism or identify the deficits or differences that person is having. But for all the parents who are joining, while we like this as a concept, and while, as Vivian is saying, it's a positive way of thinking about children's differences, we're also very conscious that services would need a diagnosis, and therefore you would still need to be able to identify what makes your child different from neurotypical, if there is such a thing as policies as neurotypical or not. So the kind of signs you would see would differ obviously across the age for autism. So with some very young children, sometimes it might be in terms of communication that some of them may not use eye contact in conventional ways. I wouldn't say necessarily not giving eye contact. It's probably not understand the kind of conventional ways of giving eye contact. And as I already said, not understanding social rules that are kind of typical. So where you where you think you have taught the child something, and sometimes children on the autistic spectrum can be very, very honest, which means that they'll actually say to somebody who comes in saying, you don't look well, or you smell funny, or which are not what we would expect for a child to usually say. So those kind of things might start to make you think there is something different here in terms of the kind of social patterns and behaviors. Communication often is a big thing. For some children, it might vary from very limited communication or limited speech, especially where children may actually not be using speech at all to communicate their things, to children who would have a lot of language but may not necessarily be understanding the nuances of language. So we often say about the kind of the subtleties of when you say, would you like to pass me a glass? And the child thinks that is kind of an open request, which might be, but contextually that might differ. So things like that would happen. And I think main kind of going from the kind of diagnostic criteria, if we look at DSM-5 or ICD-11, they would also talk about adherence to routines. So where the child would want to follow the same patterns, want to do the same play or do actions in a specific way. So there's a specific bedtime routine that the child would insist, and if that's not happening, they would find it hard to settle down, or perhaps play with toys in slightly unconventional way, or with other children in a slightly kind of unconventional way. So it's kind of a range of differences. And of course, for autism itself, we use the term spectrum just to kind of explain that it influences or impacts each individual in a very, very different way from each other. But I'm sure Vivian would have something else to add on to that.
Indeed. Thank you so much. Over to you, Vivian.
Yeah, what I would like to add is to say that these common signs are not specific to every individual. So you don't just write it out and then start looking out for that and say, oh, this is what's happening or this is not what's happening, because it can be different for different individuals. It can be one of it, it can be two of it, it can be all of it. And you also do not want to be at that place where any little thing, maybe if you see your child playing with a toy or your child's routine is disrupted and they kick off, you say, oh, maybe he's autistic. You don't label until you're diagnosed, right? So it's a spectrum, for most people. From my own experience and in my research, for most people, it was revolving around communication, right? Around, slow communication, delayed communication, and then with every other thing that Prithvi has also said. Yeah.
I mean, thank you so much for that. And I do see some comments in the chat area. Thanks for the comments. We have one comment saying, my child is an older teen and navigating their identity with neurodivergence and often struggles to self-advocate when they're trying to discard with the masking demands that social situations place on them. Thanks for sharing that. I mean, one of the things that also strikes me from just listening to both Prithvi and Vivian is, for instance, when you talked about the honesty of it, you know, so it's almost liberating in the sense that the children just speak. They don't have those inhibitions which society sort of places on people. And that in itself shows that sometimes, if it is problematized, it's because we're not coping properly, or we're thinking, how do we just not deal with this? How do we just shy away from the situation? But that's not what we want to do. We want to create an enabling environment, an empowering environment for the children, for the young people, but also for the families. So thanks for sharing that. And
Yeah,
just building on
can
that,
I
yeah.
also say, because the word masking came up, right? That's another thing, because a lot of people might be masking, so you may not even get to see the signs or the symptoms, right? And masking is not always so. When we talk about masking, we always think it's masking. For example, for lack of a better word, the negative symptoms or the negative signs, right? Sometimes masking can be as in masking in a positive way. So, for example, a neurodiverse child or an autistic child that I was working with, the grandpa passed away, right? And he didn't feel anything. He didn't feel any emotion, right? And what masking looked like is that he walked into the room, saw everyone crying, and felt that that is what is expected of him. So he starts to cry. So this is what they do. This is what masking is. They pay attention to how other people communicate, how other people do things, and then adapt themselves to do things that way to meet that need. So they might mask their own self-expression or their own way of expressing, and you may never get to know that this person is actually struggling. So sometimes the signs might not be there, initially, until maybe something happens.
I mean, that's a very interesting point you raise, and thanks for clarifying that, because I was going to ask you next. Sometimes you hear parents say it's more difficult to identify this in girls compared to boys, because girls have a way of, perhaps, for want of a better word, masking. Is that something you also saw in your research?
Well, not in my research, but there are quite a good number of literatures that allude to that, to say that it's more difficult to identify in girls. Because of the masking, girls tend to mask because girls have that what's the word, that need to socially fit in, to be right, to act right, to do these things right, and that social conditioning. So girls tend to mask their own symptoms much more than boys, and it's harder to find to kind of like it starts to show up later in girls for many reasons as well.
Thank you so much for that. And we have a comment here. Thanks for the comment saying masking can make parents second guess themselves as their children may perform well at school and teachers won't notice anything and tell parents everything is fine.
True.
And that touches on a very important point, which we will have to explore in a bit more detail later this evening, which is precisely how do we manage relationships with schools? Because on the one hand, from this example, it is a relationship where perhaps the child is doing well at school, but it could even be the reverse, where the child doesn't seem to be doing well at school, and then you have this miscommunication. So we will want to explore how to manage that situation to support children better. But before we do, I'm just wondering, Vivian, based on your work in the field, what were some of the common misconceptions you found that people held or people still hold, because it is still a real issue in relation to neurodiversity or neurodivergence? Could you share, please?
Yeah, so there are quite a number of misconceptions, especially which were more highlighted when I was doing my research. And some of these misconceptions were around, what parents believed about the behaviors that their children were exhibiting, which they didn't attribute to autism. So we had parents who felt that their children were just being stubborn, right? So, for example, a typical autistic child, when their routine is disrupted, like we have highlighted here, might just find it very difficult to transition and then have a meltdown and kick off. Most parents would attribute that to a child being, stubborn, just wanting to give them problem. There's also the misconception that children who are struggling with their academics were academically dull. So a lot of parents had, that idea that, oh, this child needed a tutor, needed to do better in English, was not reading, why can't you read like your mates? Why are you bad in maths and stuff like that? But they didn't realize at the time that the child was not neurotypical. Then there were parents who felt that when you talk about autism, that it had to do with physical disability for some reason. So I had quite a number of parents who said, "Oh, I didn't know my child was autistic until the school told me. I thought autism had physical signs that I needed to see. Maybe the child had to be physically disabled, for it to be autism." Then there were parents who believed that the signs started to show um, when their children were immunized in the UK. So a lot of people, quite a number of people attributed it to immunization. They said there was something about the immunization that triggered. A few parents actually said after the immunization that their children's speech started to retrogress, that kind of thing. And then there's also, in the African setting, there is, from my research, there are quite a number of participants that felt that it was, how do I phrase this? That schools exaggerates what is going, and there were a few people who alluded to the fact that maybe schools just wanted more money from the local council, so they exaggerate these symptoms to put children in to be diagnosed and stuff like that. These are all misconceptions. There are people who also believed it was a spiritual problem, that it had to do with some forces from their village or something. So these are all misconceptions. Scientifically, neurodiversity has to do with the way a person's brain works. Like we have tried to explain that our brains are differently. The way our brains receive and interpret information is different. And all of this that I have highlighted, neurodiversity doesn't mean that your child is stubborn. It doesn't mean that your child is dull. It means that maybe they receive that particular information differently. It doesn't mean that it's not a spiritual problem. And it's a spectrum. There are people who are called high functioning autistic people. These people are like you and I. You may never get to know. There's nothing physical that shows. Even when you communicate on a common level, you may not really know that there's something going on. So there are a good number of people who have high functioning autistics. There are people in the spectrum who are very smart, that that like their brain functioning is, they have higher IQ than the normal individual. So it's quite a spectrum. So it's not a spiritual problem at all. And there is really no evidence to show that it is linked with immunization. I don't think there's really been anything to say that a child becomes neurodiverse after being immunized. So I hope, is there anyone on the chat who has any of this misconception, or have you ever thought in this line before? And do you have any question with regards to anything I have highlighted, or are there any other misconceptions that you might have, that you want us to talk about. Betty, I hope that answers your question, though.
It does indeed. Thank you so much. And thank you for the participants who have put in their questions in the Q&A. Please carry on using the Q&A. So if you have any questions that you would like to put through to the panelists, please type in the Q&A if you're on Zoom, and then you can carry on with the chats, putting in comments in the chats area as well. Now, I would like to ask Majinda the exact same question. As a parent who's experienced working with schools, supporting the child, what are some of the misconceptions you can share around neurodiversity, linked to what Vivian has said, but maybe something completely different? Can you hear us, Majinda?
Apologies. I think I'm going to share the same sentiment with regard to misconceptions. Is when there is no diagnosis, generally their behavior, their emotional dysregulation is just categorized as naughty behavior. They have emotional dysregulation, they will have meltdowns, or they're being just resistant to change. And this comes from their autistic condition, but because there is no diagnosis, so that's generally, even when there is my experience is even when there is a diagnosis, they still don't have the full awareness of the reasons why it happens and what to do. Another thing that I have noticed that there's a generally misconception that neurodivergent children lack empathy or emotion, which is not really true. They may have, they may differ in their expression and processing of emotions, but it doesn't mean they lack of empathy or emotion. They might express the empathy in a very different and need more explicit communication to understand other people's emotional states. Then I think Prithvi and Vivian both mentioned that with regard to sociability, they do miss the standard social cues. And then there's a misconception that they can't fit in the society.
Thank you so much for that, Majinda. I think, having listened to all of you share, first, what does this mean? What does neurodiversity mean? What are some of the common signs? What are some of the common misconceptions? I'd like to ask you, Prithvi, could you highlight for us the importance of early identification and intervention?
I suppose what Vivian and Majinda were saying there is partly what is the importance of early intervention and early identification. And I think we've had a comment also about kind of the term neurodiversity and how it might be actually a smokescreen and missing the subtleties. And as I said earlier on, neurodiversity is a term that's used to describe a range of differences, but for a diagnostic purpose, early kind of identification would require to know whether this is autism, whether it's dyslexia, dyspraxia, or ADHD. So there are specific criteria that are used for identification. And I think identification is important partly because once you have early identification, then research suggests that we could actually, if the right support has been put in place, then that would have a huge impact in terms of the child's development, in terms of their own learning. The second bit, I think, which is more important for me, is that like Vivian and Majinda said, sometimes if you hear stereotypical views about yourself, if you're being told, so for example, somebody with dyslexia has been told that they're just thick or stupid, that they can't read or understand, or you're dyspraxic, so you're a clumsy one who can't do anything, or if those kind of words have been used by other people to describe you, that will have a huge impact on your self-esteem. And I think early identification would give the knowledge to parents, but also to the children and young people themselves, that the way they behave differently is not because they're not trying hard enough, but because they are actually different. And I think that's really, really important for having that self-knowledge. And I think early identification can prepare firstly for parents, because like Vivian and mentioned, they're saying parents can go through a range of emotions and a range of perceptions about what neurodiversities or autism or dyslexia, dyspraxia, ADHD, any of these conditions are. And unless parents are in a place where they know exactly how to support their child or young person, they'll not be able to help the child or young person to thrive and engage as well. And on a very kind of pragmatic level, I think early identification is important because a lot of services as of now in the UK are aimed for early intervention. So the later your child gets the diagnosis, there's less support, unfortunately. It is important to kind of understand and highlight and try and get that kind of an information about your child rather than sitting and worrying. And I know somebody said, my child is 6 and I've been told that it's a maturity issue and wait on. And kind of building on from what Vivian said earlier, early identification is particularly hard for children from minority ethnic communities because not just because of the community understanding, but also because professional understanding. So professionals don't necessarily understand the difference between bilingualism and dyslexia or bilingualism and autism. So there are sometimes delays for children from minority ethnic communities to get these diagnoses. But I think as parents, what we can do and what I would encourage others to try and kind of work around is to try and think, if you feel there's something different, then try and get that, because that will have a huge impact in terms of secondary behaviors not developing as well. Because if you're really frustrated and if you don't have adequate support, then you are going to show your frustration either through behavior, which we might find challenging, or perhaps would have actually an negative impact on the mental well-being of the child.
I mean, thanks for that. Just still on the point of early intervention, seeking support, and perhaps diagnosis, we have a question which I'd like to ask you, Prithvi. It is from one of our members of the audience participants. What are the levels of diagnosis in autism? And is there any relationship between gut health and autism?
Okay. The diagnostic criteria for autism has changed in 2013, where before that we did have levels of autism. So we did use terms such as high functioning autism or low functioning autism, or even autism, Asperger syndrome, and other kinds of terms. The current criteria is that in terms of officially diagnosing, the diagnosis would only be provided as autism spectrum disorder. We are going away from the neurodiversity language. It's going to be called as a disorder or condition, as some people would do. But some clinicians, what they are doing is then they are combining that with additional differences that somebody with autism would have. So it might be that autism with language difficulties, autism with intellectual disabilities, autism with language and intellectual disabilities. So that's how in DSM-5, which is one of the diagnostic criteria, they talk about level 1, level 2, level 3 levels of support, rather than necessarily in terms of how it impacts. So it's slightly moving or changing in terms of terminology and levels. With the gut factor, it's not that it's slightly chicken and egg scenario, I suppose. There is limited evidence to suggest that problems with gut causes autism. Again, it's one of those misconceptions that I think Vivian was kind of trying to say, because in the past, some people at least felt that problems with the gut would lead to autism. So there was this theory of leaky gut syndrome, which means that your impurities are moving out of your gut, getting into your blood system and impacting on your brain. Evidence for that is very, very shaky. But what we do know is that a lot of children, young people, adults on the autistic spectrum do have digestive problems. So digestion and therefore for very young children, sometimes also toilet training might take longer for children on the autistic spectrum compared to children who do not have autism. So that is something to consider. And some of the parents are saying, if your child is unable to actually verbalize and say, I'm in pain, then that is also tricky, because if you have severe stomach cramps, for example, how do you exhibit that? So there might be sometimes behaviors that we consider as challenging might actually have a physical reason, such as indigestion.
Thank you so much. I'll pick one of the questions here in the Q&A because it's sort of linked to this early elements of the conversation around understanding neurodiversity, neurodivergence, autism. And the question is there anything like virtual autism? If there is, how different is it from ASD?
I'm not quite sure what virtual autism means, I must say.
Okay.
So we may need some explanation of who it said kind of what is virtual autism. But I suppose what my guess is that it is perhaps saying that is autism only happening in certain places? If that's what the question is, then it is a condition that is going to be more visible when there's social interaction. So on a virtual field where you perhaps do not necessarily need to interact with people in a face-to-face and in a kind of a real life scenario, and you have time to think about your own views, your autism may or may not be as evident as it is in a social situation where you're asking quick reflexes and reading body language and all of that. But I'm not sure whether that is the right answer for the question we had there.
Thank you very much. Vivian, would you like to speak to that? But I would also say for whoever sent in the question, thank you very much. If you want to elaborate a bit more, feel free to do so using the Q&A function.
I think Prithvi has spoken to that. I'll speak to the guts, the question on guts. I think, most times autistic people exhibit a lot of is that autism is quite associated with a lot of anxiety, right? And anxiety have been seen to be connected with gut problems. So that might be, sometimes it might just be that the anxiety is what's causing the gut problem. That's just an additional thing to look out for. If your child is experiencing that, it might be associated more with the anxiety that they're experiencing, rather than it being about the autism itself.
Thank you so much for that. And I think just listening to you, Vivian, the point you've just made reminds us about the importance of just understanding your child as a parent and, seeing if they're showing signs of distress or if they're withdrawn, just looking out for them and knowing when there's just something different. Because if you notice there's something different, perhaps it would lead us to start exploring further with them. And I guess also building that relationship of trust so that they trust enough to be able to open up, and then get the support from the parents. But thanks a lot for that. I'd like to move the conversation to understanding some of the main barriers in the communities, the African communities, minority ethnic communities, barriers around neurodiversity, getting support, and indeed, getting resources as well. We have some questions in the Q&A that already speak to that. And I would like to start from Majinda's experience. If that's okay, Majinda, could you share your experience as a parent of a neurodivergent child and what's it been like for you and your family?
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful to have the privilege to share my experience with the wider audience and shed light on the challenges in navigating the system and raising a neurodiverse child, actually. I think the purpose of sharing the experience with the audience of those connected with the neurodiverse children is to build a bridge of empathy and understanding, shed light on the often unseen struggles and resilience that are required to navigate the complex system that often fails to meet our children's unique needs. It's about encouraging a dialogue, actually, sharing resources and fostering a collective effort towards systemic change and inclusion of our neurodiverse children. My journey as the parent of an 11-year-old gifted daughter, who is also on the autism spectrum, has been a profound learning curve, filled with both challenges and moments of sheer resilience. Many of you has already mentioned about the children with high IQ. My daughter is a bright and incredibly talented child with remarkably high IQ. So, navigating the journey of parenting a neurodiverse child, especially as one as a gifted as my daughter, has been an emotionally taxing and physically demanding, as I have to grapple with the complexities of health authorities and educational system, all while facing a significant lack of awareness and information. I'm not really sure if that's the case only with the African and ethnic minority cases, or is it with everybody. As I'm a city lawyer, so I cannot say that I live in silos either. So, but I just did not have any awareness, any information on neurodivergence at all. So my daughter is blessed with an exceptional talent and diverse talents, spanning from music, sports, drama, academics. She has a potential without limits. She's brilliant in everything. Despite her brilliance, our journey has been marred with formidable challenges arising from a lack of understanding and support within the educational system and healthcare framework both. Despite these gaps, her unique needs have gone unmet within the current educational framework, leading to the constant threats of exclusion and a distressing cycle of unmet needs and missed opportunities. This road has been fraught with obstacles for us, from the complexities of health authorities to the rigidity of educational institutions that are ill-equipped to cater to her unique needs. Her journey marked by the threats of exclusion from school, events, activities, school trips, and a painful cycle of unmet needs, basically. It emphasizes this systemic failure to recognize and nurture the diverse talents of neurodiverse children. This oversight not only stifles their potential, but also subjects them to a cycle of discrimination and misunderstanding, particularly for high-functioning children whose symptoms may not be immediately apparent. In fact, their symptoms are not immediately apparent. They are not apparent at all. High-functioning children's symptoms are absolutely masked. Being a girl and on top of a high-functioning, there weren't any apparent symptoms. So this journey has also highlighted the variances in how neurodiversity presents itself. My daughter, who has thrived in many areas, struggled from nursery onwards due to unrecognized symptoms to her condition. Unfortunately, her brilliance often masked these symptoms, leading to misinterpretation of her behavior. She's being naughty, she's spoiled, she's rude. So all sorts of things we never said to her. We're going to exclude her from school. She doesn't fit in this environment. All sorts of things I have heard. Our experience has been further complicated by lengthy wait for professional assessments and a disheartening encounter with the school administration. Last year in October, they issued an ultimatum for a forced departure from the school, citing that they lack resources to support her needs. So this paints a stark picture of the systemic barriers to inclusion and support for neurodiverse children. And if families are from African or ethnic minorities backgrounds, this aggravates the challenges faced by them. At this stage, the school suspected my daughter to be on the autism spectrum, on the spectrum, but there was no formal diagnosis, and I'm talking about the last October. But there was a long wait of 2 years at NHS, which was very frustrating for me. School was not ready to wait for anything, and they told us that we should find another school for her by December. So on hearing this devastating news about my daughter's potential exclusion, and with no clear guidance and no luck with the health authorities, I embarked on a relentless search for alternatives. This led me to private assessments on my GP's advice and through connections with AfriKindness. I have the privilege to be one of the trustees of AfriKindness, and I have to say that I used all the support I managed to get from AfriKindness. So the support from AfriKindness and support from families and friends, I managed to get some private assessments and managed to get the diagnosis. And this diagnosis actually took us from London to Birmingham and Southampton. So that reflects my commitment to understanding and addressing the root cause of my daughter's discomfort, bypassing the prolonged waiting periods at NHS, and bringing clarity to our understanding of my daughter's needs. However, despite obtaining a diagnosis and fighting for her right to inclusion, the journey remains grueling, with ongoing challenges in ensuring that she receives equal treatment, equal opportunities at school is a constant battle. This experience emphasizes the critical need for accessible support systems for neurodivergent children and their families, particularly those from African or ethnic minorities. This narrative isn't just our story, it's a call to action for systemic change to support neurodiverse children and their families to listen, to understand, and adapt so that every child can thrive according to their remarkable potential. It highlights the urgent need for accessible support system, awareness, and a shift towards inclusivity and understanding in both educational and healthcare settings. As we look towards a future of potential transitions, our hope lies in collective effort to embrace and nurture the diverse talents of all our children, ensuring they are afforded the opportunities to thrive. So, my experience hasn't been very positive, but it's a relentless battle and it's utmost resilience that I have to show. And I think that continues for throughout so far and is going to continue. She's a brilliant child, but we just don't have the support system that we need.
Thank you so much, Majinda. Thank you for sharing with us. And of course, you can count on us to support you in any way possible. Thank you for sharing. And we can also only say good luck with everything. And we're here with you, walking the road and happy to support. So thanks for sharing.
Thank you.
I mean, that was a powerful story. You've shared it with us before, but each time I hear it, it just brings it all back to life, how real this is for parents. And it's interesting, you have a legal background, you have these resources, which ordinarily should shield you, from some of the challenges which other parents may face in different circumstances. But I think your story points to the fact that we're only as strong as the weakest link, essentially. So if there's a problem, and it's not fixed, then chances are that it will affect everyone else. There's a parable that says if you throw a stone in the market, you need to be careful because it just might meet your mother who's in the marketplace. So it's injury to one, injury to all. And that's why we have these conversations, because we want to be sure that we're creating a system, supporting a system that supports all the children. Because you never know. It doesn't have to be you. It doesn't have to be me. It could be anybody. But let that child out there get the support that they need. It's really important.
I think challenges are sky high and is constant. They having a legal background only means that I can fight back very well, but it is still taxing, physically and mentally both.
Indeed. Thank you, Majinda.
This has to change.
It does, indeed. I'd like to ask you, Vivian, you've heard Majinda's story, you've spoken to other parents in the field, you've seen diverse experiences, and we even have a question that speaks to support from schools. So on this issue of support, I'd like to ask you, what are some of the barriers that teachers and perhaps other professionals face in supporting children from minority ethnic backgrounds? Are there things you have seen that speak to this issue? Or perhaps I can ask Prithvi that question, and then I'll come back to you, Vivian, specifically on your research. So Prithvi, based on your experience on, culture, ethnicity, autism, what are some of the common barriers that teachers face, especially? And linked to that, we have a question in the Q&A that's really asking that there are parents who get into denial of their children being in the spectrum, and this delays early intervention. So how can parents be approached by schools to at least take the children for a diagnosis? Over to you, Prithvi.
Okay, thank you. I think the challenges are pretty much similar to what Majinda is saying from a professional perspective, in the sense that the knowledge of neurodiversity or autism amongst teachers varies quite a bit, which means that teachers may not necessarily understand autism or neurodiversity sufficient to actually support the child or to support parents with that. Additional to that, as you said, my research interest is looking around kind of experience of families and children, young people from minority ethnic communities. And it's important for me partly because the masking and prevalence rates that were talked about girls earlier on are actually even more exacerbated when it comes to ethnicity, because the prevalence rates of autism based on ethnicity in the UK vary quite a bit. So you have over-assessment and you have under-assessment of autism in minority ethnic communities. So some communities, you're very unlikely to get a diagnosis of autism. Same happens with children who are bilingual, that children who are bilingual in the UK are very unlikely to get a diagnosis of autism compared to children who are monolingual. Doesn't mean it is not there, but what it does mean is that teachers, professionals do not necessarily understand when autism occurs, or some of the other neurodiversities occur in children who are perhaps culturally, linguistically diverse. And that makes it tricky for them to actually understand, how do I support this child? What is it that this child is facing? Is this just developmental differences because they are having to mask their cultural identity? I won't talk about autism, just the fact that I pretend to be more white when I'm in white spaces compared to when I'm in Asian spaces. So I'm masking all the time. So is this just that I'm culturally inept, or is it autism? So teachers are not always aware of that, which means that they cannot actually support with those factors. And where children are navigating, talking about autism specifically, which kind of challenges some kind of social rules and understanding, when they're navigating different cultures and different contexts with children, they would need a much more flexible set of social rules and understanding. Again, whether teachers have a know-how of, for example, what would be cultural appropriate social behaviors in a Nigerian family compared to school setting, and giving that knowledge is really important. And teachers may not have that, which means that they're only teaching. I often say social skill training by teachers or speech and language therapists tends to be very white, middle class, female training. So a lot of autistic boys are taught to be very good middle class women rather than being themselves, because that's what the training packages have come from, which then leads to the kind of situations that some of the parents are saying, where the child behaves in a very specific way in one setting, but they are behaving in a very different way in the other setting because they have not been provided the skills. And that's partly because teachers do not have that knowledge and skills right now to do that. Along with that, I think the other challenge, as going back to that question you have, is that some of these neurodiversities, especially, I'll stick with autism for now, concepts like autism are fairly new in some parts of the world, which means a lot of languages do not have a term for autism. A lot of parts in the world officially do not recognize autism as a disability or a condition that's discrete from intellectual disabilities. So families, especially first generation immigrants, but also perhaps settled communities, may not have actually come across the concept of autism ever before. And when schools are suggesting that your child might have autism or some kind of a disability or difference, from their perspective, they are looking that my child is healthy, as in they're all physically fine. As Vivian was saying, there's no physical symptom to do, and there's no cultural concept of this difference for them to understand, which means that there's this kind of a disparity between professional knowledge and understanding of what they think normality or neurodiversity is to what families think. And that's where I think a lot of tension happens. In answer to that question, I think I often say, rather than going with frameworks and terminologies and say your child has autism or we suspect your child has autism, a better way of trying to work with that is to try and help the parents to try and reflect on what is the child doing, which is different, whether it's positive or whether it's causing a challenge. And then say, okay, if those are the kind of differences, let's see how other children are doing. And sometimes families might just need, parents might just need actually an opportunity to compare. Because if you have only one child and you never had a comparison of what typical development would be, how would you know that what you're having is considered to be a disability? So having those opportunities and dialogues is really important before we start putting frameworks of disabilities and differences and saying, because if that happens, then especially if the families have experienced marginalization or discrimination or racism in some context, that will be perceived as you are being racist, you're being discriminated, you're just trying to get me and my child out of this context. And it's not going to be a really helpful discussion. And unfortunately, I mean, a piece of research we did with teachers also feel quite tied up because there are not really resources out there for them to help children from minority ethnic communities who are coming from neurodiverse backgrounds. So they have no idea of how do I differentiate my curriculum for a autistic child who's bilingual and comes from Nigeria. There isn't that knowledge base right now. So there's lack of information, and there's a lot that we need to do as a multicultural society to equip our professionals to actually truly work with multicultural children and their families. I think that's kind of challenges. And of course, we all know the big word that is the funding, the kind of lack of funding that a lot of teachers are struggling, because that means resources are being pulled away from schools, which makes it tricky for them. No happy answers for parents who are attending. Sorry, I'm presenting a very depressive picture. I apologize, but that's what Perry has asked me to answer.
Well, I mean, there's a question in the Q&A that could maybe flip this slightly. Okay. So choose your next words carefully, Prithvi. But really, the question is, and thanks to the person who sent in the question, it is, what have findings from research shown policymakers and institutions can do to ensure that neurodiverse individuals from African and ethnic minority backgrounds have equitable access to resources and support services? So, for instance, you mentioned the funding, you mentioned tailoring teaching materials. So what else do you think policymakers and institutions can do so that perhaps that can inform advocacy as well?
Yeah, I mean, we did a piece of research for which we called it as marginalized families' experiences of autism. And what parents valued from our research and what teachers felt was helpful was actually listening to parents and listening to the young person. Because if you start with that process of to make equitable service, you need to know exactly what the child or the family is going through and not go with your point of view. And that is a very simple thing. We don't need a lot of funding to genuinely listen to parents and genuinely listen to the child, and not kind of brush it out like some parents said, because your child is perfectly behaving in the school, there's no problem. The problem lies with you as a parent. And this kind of a blaming culture, if we just kind of remove some of those things, that would really help. And for me, it's also sometimes changing the focus, because a lot of research around ethnicity and autism nowadays stigmatizes minority ethnic communities. So they're starting, a lot of research says the fault lies with the community. And again, that is not really helpful, because if we are going to have equitable partnerships, we need to recognize part of what neurodiversity is saying, that there's multiple perspectives of diversity and difference. And my view might be just as valuable as yours. And to work effectively in a kind of with families from minority ethnic communities, we need to listen to those things and value that and frame more culturally sensitive services. That's what I always argue for.
Thank you. And that's a very important point you've made, Prithvi, which indeed is what we try to do with Africana. So for instance, when I introduced the Parents Web app later, it's really born out of a desire to get the authentic voices of parents in this space, because it's one thing to say there are no resources out there, there's no support out there, but the other thing is for us to get involved in that process, to be able to shape the policies, give your perspective, get involved in the research, get involved in the conversations, so that if there's a question being asked, there's someone to answer the question. So we hope that you will be there, you'll work with us, you join the web app, you join our training so that we can take things forward, because it's time to act. So it's not enough for us to identify the problems, but it is time for us to think about solutions that are really tailored to the context of African and minority ethnic communities. So thanks for that, Prithvi. I'll come to you, Vivian, with the next question. And this is really building on your research and experiences in the community. What other barriers did you encounter in terms of parents accessing support for children?
Thank you. So yeah, last year I carried out this research to really understand from an African perspective the barriers that African parents were facing with accessing autism diagnosis in the UK. And there were three common all the barriers or the themes that emerged were, we grouped them under three common themes, right? And the first thing we noticed was from the data that we got was that there was really, really a gap in knowledge and awareness. And like we have seen, I mean, Majinda was told that her daughter is autistic. Majinda is a city lawyer, so you won't say, she's not educated. She's very well educated. She's out there, but she hadn't heard about it. So Prithvi also highlighted, a common thing that might be something to reflect on, which is there is no cultural concept of what autism is, for you to really, have an idea of what it is. So your child might be exhibiting those symptoms, but it will never come to mind that this might be autism until you're told. So from the participants of the research, there was really poor awareness, and this awareness where it was in diverse forms. There were sub-teams under awareness, which is there are people who had never heard of autism prior to their child being told that their child was showing the symptoms, maybe by the school. There are people who had limited awareness, which means that they knew or they had heard or they had read somewhere about autism, but they didn't know what it was all about. They just knew what autism was. And then there were people who had misconceptions, and which is like some of those misconceptions that I highlighted earlier. And this is like a barrier, because if you don't know what it is, if you haven't heard about it, or if you have misconceptions around it, then how would you even start to seek diagnosis? How would you even start to seek help if your child, is having challenges? Then there's the religious and cultural factors. So a lot of parents were in denial, just like I think there was a question that spoke to that, right? A lot of parents were in denial. A lot of people, if you're from the African background, what we say, God forbid, is not my portion. So a lot of people were in that space where they felt that there was nothing wrong with their child, that it would go away after some time, right? So that's even from the time they were told to before they actually accepted, it was really a long time, because they expected that the symptoms would go away, the child would outgrow it, and that was a barrier to them seeking, the diagnosis that they needed to proceed to getting the help and support that they could give to their children. And then there were the skepticism around service providers, right? There's the thing of not trusting the system, not trusting the professionals, not trusting their motives, not trusting the schools. Why, are they saying that my child has autism? Do they mean well for us? And just like Prithvi said, if you have experienced marginalization or racism in any way, that there's that, skepticism, there's that pushback when you're being told that your child is different or your child needs some form of help. So there was that where parents were defensive, they didn't trust the system, and this was like a major barrier to them actually accessing the help that they could get for their children. And then there's that institutional barrier. which is the long waiting list. That was very frustrating for a lot of parents. These are parents who have come to a point where they're saying, okay, now we know that this is the problem. Where do we go from here? And then they make a step to actually say, okay, we want to get a diagnosis, and you're being told that you have to wait for 1 year. You're being told that you have to wait for 2 years, and the school is on your neck because your child is not fitting in well in school, and all of that. And even for some people who eventually get diagnosis, there's also another wait list for school placement, which was a problem as well. So you know so you found out that your child has gotten diagnosis, and you know and they now need a special school to go to a special school. There's another wait list for them to actually get the school placement. So that the wait list is actually a major problem. And then the difficulty accessing information. This was a major barrier for many, because they were like, the pathway to diagnosis is not straightforward. You can't particularly say these are the 3 steps to getting diagnosis. It was just difficult to find the information, to find the guidance, that you needed to get diagnosis. So these were some of the barriers that were highlighted by the research, categorized under 3 major headings, that is knowledge and awareness of autism, religious and cultural factors, and then institutional factors.
Thank you so much for sharing, Vivian. And just building on that, Prithvi, Vivian has highlighted diagnosis as one of the key issues, the long waiting list, and how that could perhaps put parents off. Now, we've said we want to end on a positive note. We want to end on an empowering note, share the resources, share the strategies to make a difference, a positive difference in the lives of our parents, our families, the children, and young people. So the question is, Prithvi, is there a way through which parents can access diagnosis early, on time? Any tips to share?
Well, I think the straight answer is no. I'll say that, because as Majinda has said, I think there is a huge increase of number of children who are seeking it, or families who are seeking a diagnosis of autism across the country. So depending upon the local authorities and your local services, the waiting list range from 18 months to 3 years. Right now, that's the waiting list. So I don't think you can get a diagnosis earlier, so to speak. But I think what we can do, or what you can do as a parent, I suppose, is trying to understand a bit more about autism or any of kind of neurodivergent conditions that we are talking about, and use that information. I'm not going to specifically kind of signpost you to specific things, but there are actually some checklists which are aimed for parents to try and identify whether there are differences or not. So if you can actually use that, or Paula, as you say, yes, up to 5 years in some places, waiting list. So if you can actually use some of that, your own knowledge about autism or dyslexia or dyspraxia to a certain extent, to see why you think your child has those differences, and take that information either to the educational context, to your child's school, or then to your GP, who might be able to provide a reference. That might slightly speed up the process in terms of getting a diagnosis, because what they cannot see as a clinician is how your child behaves outside the clinic, which you have a lot of knowledge of. And sometimes in a clinic setting, some children actually perform much better, because that kind of a structure and lack of stimulation and would actually help some children to kind of show their best performance, which may not be the challenges that you see in a home setting. And I know schools say it differently, but the current law in England, at least for education, is that you don't necessarily need a diagnosis of autism to have support. Okay, because the education healthcare plans are focusing on whether the child needs any support educationally. And if you can try and again explain to the school setting, okay, this is what my child is finding difficult with, in a way they have a reason to do it, to help you to kind of help and understand. And I'm not saying always go with the militant face to try and say, I got it right, you got it wrong, because then you go into that loggerhead, and that never kind of solves. But if you're going to go and say, this is what I find has worked with my child in home setting, this is what I find as challenging, could you try and implement that in your school setting? That kind of, you're going for a negotiation, and that might encourage the schools also to put in some of those services, and perhaps support your request for education healthcare plan, or in terms of actually making a reference to doctors on their behalf, kind of thing. So I would say, win the trust, gain your knowledge, take your information of what works, what not works, and that might be the way to proceed.
Thank you so much for that, Prithvi. And just to say that I know sometimes it can be daunting, the amount of resources on the internet, that in itself could be a challenge, which is why we try to gather resources and put them on the parent web page, so that at least there is some kind of well, it's a start, there's a starting point, manageable, bit-sized information, which we hope parents can then build on to explore further. And indeed, for today's webinar, we have approached our panelists, and they have kindly shared with us some resources which they think would be a good place to start, just to see where you are in terms of understanding neurodiversity and some of the issues we have already discussed today. And in the chat area, we have put in a link to the resource, the parents' webpage. So please engage with that. And if you have any more resources that you have found helpful, let us know, and we'll be more than happy to share that on the webpage as well. Now, Prithvi mentioned a very important point in terms of how to communicate with schools. So he's provided some pointers. He said, don't go in, fighting, but go in open-minded, but also with some information based on your experiences and your understanding of the child. Because you spend more time with the child at home, you probably see the child in a different setting, exhibiting different behaviors, which could be helpful for schools in supporting the child. So I'd like to ask you, Vivian, can you share some more in relation to how parents can effectively communicate with schools, and perhaps what kinds of questions parents can ask so that they can get useful information from the schools, but also inform the lesson plan or the learning plan for their children in a way that empowers the children?
Yeah, I think I'll just ride on what Prithvi has said. First of all is the mindset, because how you're operating on the inside will determine how you engage on the outside, right? So when that information comes, what I think personally, what I would say is, as a parent, first of all, approach it from the point of view that you are trying to support your child, and anything for the best interest of the child, right? And don't look at it that the school is against you or out to get your child. There are instances where it might seem like, the school just wants to get the child out of the system because they don't have the right, the capacity to further support the child. But then, as a parent, you first of all have to take the information and accept that this is the problem that you have at hand, and then go in, I suppose, with the mindset to collaborate with the school to find what is appropriate for the child. And questions to ask, like Prithvi highlighted, is, first of all, if a child is struggling, one of the major things to get is the education and healthcare plan. So that is where, for many parents that I have met, they found the school support quite helpful in that whole process. While some people would say the school didn't help and they had to, do all of that. The school helped minimally and they had to struggle to fill all the forms and all of that. It's quite a process, but just to know what to ask, to say, okay, my child is struggling. How do we go about, getting, what are the needs? First of all, what are their needs? Is there a way of, supporting their needs, and how can we get the educational and health plan, for the child? Because it is when you have that document that you can then further engage, the school. ask for the special. I think every school has a Senko. Ask for the Senko and speak to them to find out what support or what capacity that they have at the moment to support your child's needs. And I feel like when they see that you're coming from a collaborative point of view and not just to fight them, there's a likelihood for them to be more open to share information and resources with you. So ask what capacity that they have at the moment to support your child and kind of like generally engage in that and build on that. It's a difficult journey, really, but asking for the Senko, asking for how to go about the educational and health plan, is a starting point, I suppose.
Thank you so much for that. And I'd like to ask Majinda, as a parent and based on your lived experiences, how do you think parents can best cope? I mean, in one of our previous webinars, we talked about self-care for parents, and I would recommend, that all of us engage with that webinar. We have the recording on the parents' webpage as well and on the parents' resources page. But it basically shares practical strategies, on how to take care of ourselves as parents, because it is a lot of work. It is a full-time job. And many people have other jobs in addition to being parents. So it's no easy task. Yeah. But
Absolutely.
based on what have you done? What have you tried? What has worked for you?
It's been very emotional and challenging journey, I have to say that. And it's so emotional that it affects parents' mental health as well and physical too. So the first and foremost thing I would say, even if you suspect that your child is on the spectrum, and let alone the diagnosis, educate yourself. That's the best thing. Educate yourself, educate your family, everybody who cares for your child, just try to educate them as well. And speak to family, friends, peers, whoever you come across. Don't think this as a stigma. Just open up. Just keep your pride on the side. I had to do that as well. I never went to somebody asking for help. But when this all happened, when the school threatened that they wanted to exclude my daughter, and for the first time, I realized that she may be on the spectrum. So when I realized that, I think part of it I suffered because of the lack of information, lack of awareness. So the first thing I did, I called my GP. He gave me some information, gave me some sort of guidance. And the second thing, I called Africanness, my fellow trustees, and my research team at Africanness, and many other people. So what I'm trying to say is ask for help. Use your support system, use this cushion you have around you, use everybody and anybody. Some people may give you some sort of guidance, some people will just listen to the problem. And that's good enough as well. And if there's some people don't know anything, they might give you some sort of guidance and some other resources. Because at that time, I didn't even know what resources to look at it, apart from just typing in the Google. So this was my main thing. The speaking, I spoke to many people. I educated myself, and I spoke to everybody. And try to access the sports services, therapies, whatever is available. Many people work and they have a corporate health insurance, and a lot of therapies are available there as part of the health insurance. These are the practical solutions which I have used. Just speak to them.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, sorry. And speak to school as well. They may not be very good, which my daughter's school wasn't very good, but that's a private school. I have had some friends go children who are on the spectrum as well, and some of them are going to go to state school. State school are a lot more helpful and supportive than the private schools. And be an advocate of your own child. Sorry, be advocate of your own child. Because there's a lot of pressure on the child itself. There's a lot of anxiety for the child. Once you need to educate yourself about what your child's needs are, and just wherever you go in the educational settings, in the healthcare settings, just be the voice of your child.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that, Majinda. And thank you. I think we had a question about virtual autism previously, so I think there's been a follow-up to explain further. So thanks for giving further information about that question to the person who's shared the question with us. And I'll read it out to you. There are doctors who diagnose children with virtual autism. They associate it with the children being affected by too much screen time, and it's something that can fade away. I also had my doubts. So is that something, does it make it any clearer, Prithvi, Vivian?
Absolutely. And I think, as the person says, there's no research evidence to say excess screen time would cause autism, because, as Vivian was trying to explain earlier, autism is how your brain thinks differently, or neurodiversities for that matter, are the way how your brain is functioning differently. And that would not just happen because of you spending more screen time. I mean, obviously, there might be some issues in terms of excess screen time, which we all need to think about, but that does not necessarily cause neurodiversity, I think. So it can make you less social polar, or it may not, because there are some specific sites which are actually helpful for autistic people to do. So I don't know if anyone has heard of places like Autoscape, for example, which is an online virtual place for autistic individuals to socially connect, because the neurotypical ways of connecting may not necessarily be easy for some autistic individuals. So actually creating social kind of virtual worlds for some individuals does work. So again, it's knowing that there's never a right or wrong thing. We are all doing this thanks to screen time, but it does not mean that we always want to just spend this only. So it's just being conscious, and going back to what we were saying about neurodiversity would mean that social interaction, social functioning, being with other people for neurodiverse people might be different from neurotypical norms. So how they may want to interact might be different from how we want to interact, and we need to be conscious of that as well.
Thank you so much for that, Prithvi. Thank you, Vivian. Thank you, Majinda. I think we've gone through all the questions we had from the audience. If anyone has any burning questions left, please feel free to let us know, because we're now coming to the end of today's webinar. It's been a very enlightening discussion, engaging, and I mean, we can't thank you enough, our panelists, but also everyone who's participated, because your interactions in the chat area, in the Q&A, has made this all the more enlightening. You've thrown up so many issues which perhaps we weren't going to cover, but we've had to cover based on the questions, the comments, the suggestions. Thank you. And I'm hoping that everyone who's joined today has learned something new. So I think we can move on to the next bit. But if you have any questions, like I said, please let us know. Yeah. And just to say that in the beginning, I mentioned this was a conversation starter. So the idea is for us to carry on the engagement even after this webinar ends. We have the Parents Web app. We have other activities planned around neurodiversity, one of which is really engaging in the community. So we have planned an activity where we'll be going into the community, a community project to raise awareness, carry out training. And we're really thankful to our sponsors for giving us the resources needed for this research. So Leeds Community Forum and then Sir George Martin, we thank you for the funding and we thank you for the support for this. I'll ask Vivian to speak to what this project is about and how we could all get involved, especially for Black and minority communities in Leeds area and in Yorkshire as well. Over to you, Vivian.
Thank you, Paddy. The Africanist Neurodiversity Community Project is a project that we have come up with because we have obviously seen the gap in in accessing diagnosis and in getting support in the African and ethnic minority community, and we are working as an organization to build this gap. And based on the research that I did last year, some of the things we want to do is to start with engaging our community in a really, really nuanced way to understand, just like Prithvi highlighted, to understand, how our community or how parents, are seeing the experiences that they're having, and to provide education, the right education that would help improve their awareness of what, neurodiversity is, what autism is, to provide awareness, to provide education in a way that, every one of us can engage with, in a way that isn't ambiguous, in a way that we can relate with, and to also get feedback as to what your experiences are so that we can articulate those information to provide support. Because what we perceive would happen when we do this community awareness is that more people would be aware, more people would be educated, because we also want to build trust. We want to collapse that skepticism that a lot of people feel with the system, with trying to access diagnosis. So we want to be that bridge to say your child needs this support, and the system has this support. They're not against you, they're not against your child, to be that gap. So what we perceive would happen if we go into the community and bring this awareness is that there would be people who are more willing to access diagnosis. And then we can also see that the wait list is really so long. So what then happens? We also would are engaging with stakeholders to ensure that there is a way to navigate the system, because there's that systemic problems, the wait list and all of that, to kind of like provide tailored support and pathway to actually accessing diagnosis for people in our community, or even to provide a kind of support to say, while you're waiting for diagnosis, what do? How do you engage your child? Or if your child is excluded, what can they do? Are there organizations that provide, support for children who are excluded from academics while they're waiting for school placements or while they're waiting for diagnosis? So this is what we want to do, and we're starting from the Leeds and Yorkshire area. So if you're in Leeds, if you're in Yorkshire, please register so that you can see. We are rolling out a lot of webinar, a lot of information session, a lot of live on virtually and live in Leeds community engagement, to actually hear your stories, to provide information, and to essentially provide support for parents who have neurodiverse children. So that's what it is. And there's a barcode on the screen. You can just scan the barcode to register so that you get notified for any of these sessions.
Thank you so much for that, Vivian. So we'll please encourage all of us to get involved with the process. Now, the other thing I'd like to share with us is the Africanness web app. Now, I've spoken about this from the beginning, and I've talked about it in different forms. This is a virtual community where we're building a support system for parents. In that space, we have room for parents to create groups that reflect their interests, or groups that reflect the kind of support that they would want to get. So we would have people who are experts in the space providing that support on an ongoing basis. If you come on that space, you will find Vivian, for instance. Dr. Vivian's there, Agenda's there, I'm there. And then we have so many other parents and resource persons who are experts in various aspects of providing support for parents and young people. Specifically on the issue of neurodiversity, we already have a group that's been created, and we have some parents who have already joined. So thanks to all the parents who have joined. If you haven't done so already, we'll invite you to please join the group so that we can carry on providing the support, but also building the resources that we need to be able to really get tailored services for children, families, young people from African, Black, minority ethnic communities, and ensure that really the voices are heard and the support is tailored to suit their needs. So please just scan the barcode on the screen if you would like to join, and then we're more than happy to have you join the group. Thanks for that. Now, the other thing I'd like to mention is that we've talked about the resource page. We've also put in the links in the chat area. We already have the links to the web app. We also have the links to the training and also community engagement projects, which Vivian mentioned. And on the screen now, we have a QR code which links back to the resource page. And on that parents resource page, all of the resources we've talked about today, previous webinars, today's recording, as well as the resources for today, but also previous sessions are available there. So if you scan the QR code, it takes you straight to that page and you can engage with the resources there. Thanks to all of you who have also made some suggestions as to what additional resources we can have on the page. We'll be more than happy to host those resources if they'll be useful to the parents who need them. So please engage with us, share with us, and would love to hear from you. And I think we're now coming towards the end. We have a question here. If you don't mind me asking, I'll just ask really quickly. What is the right age for diagnosis? Prithvi, Vivian?
I don't think there's a right age or wrong age for diagnosis. It is actually when you notice, because again, the kind of nature of differences you see with your child. Some children, we might actually be able to spot differences at a very young age. Sometimes we may not actually see any differences till they don't have the primary school support. So some children thrive very well in primary school, and it's only when the transition happens that they actually need support, and parents and professionals start noticing the difference. So I wouldn't worry about missing the right time. Just try and seek guidance whenever you see there's a difference.
Thank you so much for that, Prithvi. There's also a training we're launching this training tomorrow, and it's on parenting with purpose. Now, that training is really focused on understanding your child's development, prioritizing mental health, self-awareness, self-care for parents, but also the idea is to provide a supportive community where parents can actually engage with professionals, experts, and other parents, like-minded parents, to get the kind of support that's needed. In listening to Majinda's story, for instance, she emphasized the difference, the positive difference, the positive impact which having a good support system made for her. So that is part of what we're aiming to achieve through this training. One of the things we'll also be covering as part of that training is to foster playful parenting, because we know that play is one of the ways in which children learn effectively. So how can parents incorporate play into their interactions with the children as a way of engaging the children, teaching the children, bonding with the children? So this training starts tomorrow. And at the moment, we're still open for registration. It's a free training, and you get all the resources about the training if you just scan the QR code. We have facilitators who are experts, and Dr. Vivian will be one of the facilitators on that training. We also have another JAS certified parents coach who is part of the parents team and will be delivering the training. So registration is ongoing, but closes at 2 p.m. tomorrow. So through the chat area, you would find a link. It isn't face-to-face only. Thanks for that question. So the training is a combination of in-person and face-to-face, but it's mostly going to be in-person and face-to-face, I say. In-person and virtual, but it's mainly going to be virtual. So we have, throughout the year, we'll have around 5 sessions, most of which will be online on Zoom. So tomorrow's session, for instance, will be online on Zoom, and it holds tomorrow evening. Now, another aspect of the training is that any parent who signs on to the training, the children their children or young people in their care would also be eligible for additional support we have planned for children, which would include, for instance, mentoring, leadership training, training on emotional intelligence, and other skills which we think are important for children's, holistic development. But it is important for the parents to get involved in the parenting with purpose training, because we're hoping that we work with the parents, try to create a conducive environment for the children, but also provide additional support to the children directly. But this is, of course, going to be with the consent of the parents who are involved in the training. So please do get involved. We hope that you can be part of this training and also share across your networks, because we want to reach as many parents as possible. But it needs to be parents who are in Leeds. And this is because there will be, I think, 2 sessions which will be face-to-face. But beyond that, we also plan to have other supports provided to parents, which may be available in person, and so will be more convenient for parents who are located locally in Leeds. And then to close, I would say, please look out for our next Parents Team webinar. I hope you've enjoyed today's session. We've really loved having you here with us. Our next session is going to be on GCSE A levels, how to support children who are, studying for their GCSEs, how to support them to be successful in the exams, how to support them cope with the challenges, how to support them even just overcome the pressure, the tensions that surround the examination. And we will have again another set of very experienced panelists working in that space who would be able to provide parents with answers to the common questions they might have, but also with resources that might be useful or that will be useful in supporting the children who will be taking these exams. So please save the date. It's going to be in April. We will confirm the dates in the coming weeks and we'll put this on our social media platforms. We hope you're following us already. If you aren't, please follow us. And now that we've come to the end, there's going to be a survey as well for today's webinar. Please take the survey. It's really important that we hear from you because we want to know how today's session has been for you. And we also want to hear from you how we can do better next time. So we already have a session coming up in April. Do you have any pointers as to what we need to be doing in the sessions? Also, are there topics you want us to be covering that are important for you as parents, as guardians? Let us know so that we can factor that into our planning for the rest of the year. But thank you for being here. Do take the survey. We look forward to hearing from you. At the end of this session, once you go off Zoom, for those of us on Zoom, you will also get the link for the survey. You'll get the questions. So please answer the questions. But otherwise, if you're online, just follow the links and the QR code and it will take you to the survey questions. And we hope that you're already following us on social media. We're on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. We are sociable and would love to hear from you. Please stay in touch with us, keep in touch, follow us, and then also get involved in the Parents Web app as well so that we can carry on the conversations and support each other through the process of parenting. And with that, I say a big thank you to our panelists, to our sponsors, to everyone who's been involved in the Afrikindness journey. We hope to carry on this with you and we hope to see you next time. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day wherever you may be. Thank you.